Hello and welcome to the MovieKing Podcast. My name is David Jurmann and I'll be your host. On today's show, I'm going to review the new A24 film, Heretic. So Heretic is a film about two female missionaries from the Mormon Church. They're going around converting people and knock on this man Mr. Reed's door, but not too long after do they find out that Mr. Reed is more than the average man and he might have plans of his own. So the film is written and directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods. They are most well known for writing the film A Quiet Place, a really great horror film, one of the best in the last decade in my opinion. And they also wrote the film The Boogeyman, which is a decent horror film, came out I think last year, and was pretty decent. And then they wrote and directed the film 65, which, to put it lightly, is one of my least favorite films of 2023. It was a movie with so much potential. I mean, literally, it's about, like, sci-fi and dinosaurs. You had, like, no way to go wrong, but somehow they just did. It really fell flat, the whole movie did, and it really just was not what I was hoping it would be. So, going into Heretic, I didn't really know what to expect. Just kind of, I'm used to them as writers. As directors, I wasn't huge on what they did with 65. So, going into this film, I was hopeful it would be good. I thought the trailer looked interesting, but I wasn't, completely sold on it yet. But I have to say, it is such an awesome, fun, and thought-provoking movie experience. The directorial upgrade from Beck and Woods is ridiculous here. Going from, 65, one of my least favorite movies of the year, to one of my favorites of this year, is crazy. They did such a good job here. I actually kind of wonder now, if they really just weren't that experienced with 65 and just learned a lot from that movie, or if maybe 65 was just a scam to get, money and then just put it towards this. I don't really know, but this movie just delivers on every level. I was so pleased with this movie. But even though they directed super well, I have to say the writing is probably the true star of the film. I guess the star that doesn't really get talked about enough, because I think the acting here is really what's going to be the most, talked about point here, but the writing is so good. And it's still very well directed. The movie actually does have very good direction. The performances have depth, the build-up is great, it immerses you, and the movie flows very, very well. And in the past, I've mentioned that a horror film is only truly scary when you're scared for the characters, and that is 100% the case here. I mean, the first half of this movie is almost entirely just long monologues and conversations. Nothing quote-unquote scary is happening on screen, but the thought of what could happen lingers in your mind. These conversations taking place are very uncomfortable. The movie just finds a way of having these conversations take place, and while, they're not, really, getting under your skin, they're still really, in your mind, and I think just, the wheels are turning, there's things moving and taking place, and just the thoughts of, what could potentially happen down the line are, I think, very scary and uncomforting. So it just kind of elevates the whole thing, and the conversations themselves are very well done, too. Because this movie has excellent writing, this is a challenging movie to make because it needs to present several arguments that can not just convince the characters, but also convince possibly the audience about what's being said, which also makes it, I think, kind of horrifying upon reflection, because it's talking about all these things, and, it's almost like trying to convince you watching it that these things might be true or may not be true, and it kind of messes with your head a bit, it's scary because it's something that we've all kind of, a lot of us anyway, have really, grown up following, religion, and, it's just we have certain ideas of what religion means, and this movie kind of, tries to take all those beliefs and twist them a lot, and just, it's really interesting to me. But a lot of people watching this movie won't really like the points being made, especially about religion and how it's observed and the people who are involved with it. If you're very, involved with religion and, you don't want to have any part of it questioned, then, I think this movie will probably rub you the wrong way. It's supposed to rub you the wrong way, but it's also hard to deny that the points here have validity to them, and, it really does make you kind of see religion in a new light, but also it does, it does leave you with interpretation. It's not just preaching to something. It's not only having a specific point of view on X. It actually kind of, is a debate where you hear two sides and decide, on your own what to take away from it. It's not asking you to pick a side and often prefers you to leave it up to interpretation, which I really appreciate. I've seen so many movies, especially like faith-based movies, where it's really just like pushing this idea on you. And I like to believe that, there's a God out there, but I mean, these like faith-based movies, they really like push it on you. Like, they're not saying like, it's like Jesus is out there, he definitely exists. And I like that this movie kind of tries to like say like, oh, maybe there is something out there, but maybe there isn't. And you can kind of, take these arguments and really like tug at them and really see what you decide. And, again, whether you agree with it or not, I think it's just a very interesting film. And thematically, it's pretty rich. I think there's a lot to think about and talk about. It sparks a lot of discussion, which I think are the best kinds of movies. Even if you don't like what it has to say, it will get you talking about how it made you feel. We don't get enough movies like that nowadays because oftentimes they play it so safe. They're not really trying to spark discussion as much as they're just trying to keep you entertained and, leave you with something that, you feel glad you spent your money on, you just had a good time. And it's okay. Those movies are fine, but it's just like, I think what makes film so interesting and makes art so interesting is that it leaves you with interpretation. It leaves you with something to take away and talk about and analyze. Even if you don't like love what it has to say, again, like it's totally fine if you don't agree with the movie, but just talking about it is what makes it interesting. And there's also some great connections within the debate in this movie that add humor to the mix. While it is a horror film, this movie is actually very, very funny. I say it's one of the funniest movies of the year, actually, to me. The movie mentions things like fast food, music, Star Wars, Spider-Man, board games, and more in its points. But it doesn't detract from what's being said. If anything, it actually, I think, enhances it. It kind of, adds something more universally like beloved to the conversation. So, even if you don't, you're just watching this, like, I don't want to hear about religion for an hour and a half. Like, I don't want to hear about that. Like, the movie actually kind of brings some pop culture and things we all know and love into the conversation and mix. So, you can kind of relate to what they're saying in a different way, maybe appreciate what they're saying in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise. Because this movie doesn't, it doesn't want to feel like a lecture. I mean, like, in a lot of ways, this movie is kind of like just going on a giant lecture, but it's not a boring lecture. It's not like a boring college professor just, going on a tangent. There's actually a lot of, entertaining points in the movie, which I find very interesting. And I think just bring, again, something else to the conversation that I enjoyed. And I also want to note that while the movie does go, like, dive into the subject, it doesn't really do, like, a complete deep dive. Like, I think it just kind of does these things on a base level, base enough that, like, I think anyone can watch it and understand what it's trying to say. Like, I haven't studied, like, all the religion in the world that much. Like, I'm not that familiar with, like, the Mormon church and just, like, all these different religions out there. Like, I think the movie just does a good enough job at covering these things in a wide range, so I think anyone can follow it and take away what it's trying to say. And now I have to talk about the performances, especially Hugh Grant, who gives my favorite performance of his in years, probably since Paddington 2, which he is great in, by the way, if you haven't seen Paddington 2. But he's charming, funny, but also creepy, weird, and unsettling. It's a mix that could have ended in disaster, but actually is in fact brilliant. And just like, it's this tonal balance that it finds that's so hard to achieve, but I think he just does it so naturally. Like, Hugh Grant in this movie, like, he just, like, there are scenes where he doesn't actually even really do much that's actually that scary for a large portion of the movie. He doesn't really do anything that, disturbing, but a lot of the time he's just making these jokes. Like, he'll say something really, like, off-putting, and then he'll, like, have this reaction that's just so, like, lighthearted. That just is so, there's like a huge disconnect there, but that's kind of why it works. It's so interesting. I love it. And the other actors here are also very good. Sophie Thatcher, who was in The Boogeyman, and Chloe East, who was in The Fabelmans, they're both here. And it's really just a movie with three big actors. You have Hugh Grant, Sophie Thatcher, and Chloe East. They're really all carrying this movie. A few extras on the side, and a few, like, maybe one side character that kind of shows up for 2 minutes, but really this is a movie that is relying entirely on these three people. And as for, Sophie and Chloe, they both sell the fear they have while also showing this nuance in their performance. They have a seriously hard job to do, and that a lot of their acting is simply based on reacting. And that's something that I really want to talk about here, because I think acting, it's like people go on these giant, monologues and give all these big yelling and screaming parts, and, that's where you really look at as acting. And then, you're not really paying as much attention to the others, but I think reacting is just as important, because you see the reactions on these people's faces, and you can see the terror there. You can see, all this thought going on in their head, and it's really hard, I think, for actors to really, channel that for such a long time. I mean, there's, Sophie and Chloe, there's large portions of the movie where they're not really saying that much. They're just literally listening to Hugh Grant's character talking for extended periods, and you just kind of cut back to them every so often. You see their faces, and you can tell there's so much going on in their minds. They're questioning everything. They're also, thinking about a lot of their past. They're thinking about what's going to happen next. It's a lot going on there. You can just see the gears turning in their heads, and as well as they're turning in our heads watching it. I think it's just so well done. And maybe, they're not as memorable in the movie as Hugh Grant is. You just, looking at them, Hugh Grant is such a standout here. I mean, he basically steals the whole movie. And, despite that, though, I think it's still certainly worth talking about these other two actors, because they really hold their own here. And I think they each have these moments where they really rise above, and you can see how good they are. But also getting into the characters, the movie basically relies on all three of them working. Mr. Reed is a very fascinating individual. He's mysterious, intelligent. You're always curious, but have caution about what he'll do next. And you can tell he has this master plan in mind, but you don't know what it is, at least on the first watch. And even on repeat viewings, because I've seen this movie twice now, you really can see that there's a lot going on in his head, and you can feel that he's doing something behind the scenes a lot of the time. And as for the two missionaries, I think they're both very endearing. You have one in Sister Barnes, who is clearly the more prepared and thinking ahead of the two. She is also more willing to take risks, and that puts her at odds with Reed much more. She's also experienced a lot in her life, which I think makes her a bit more emotionally charged throughout the film. And then you have Sister Paxton, who is much more naive and devoted to the church. But she does still think for herself, despite her approach being more aligned to playing things safe. I think there'll be a lot of people out there who say Sister Paxton is just simply not as smart as Sister Barnes, and while that may partially be true, I think it's just that Paxton isn't really as bold as Barnes is. She's just very much, trying to figure out how to get out. She's not really a risk taker. She's just let's just be as nice and accommodating as possible. Maybe he'll let us go then, Meanwhile, Barnes is just if we're as challenging as possible, that's how we'll get out. And you can really feel, I think personally, I could see both of their sides to the point. I'm I don't really know which one's going to work here, because you don't really understand watching it the first time, what Mr. Reed is up to. And I think that, not knowing that kind of makes this interesting, is Paxton right? If you're just nice to him, will he let you go? And then you're also Barnes, yeah, if you really put a fight against him, maybe, that's the only way you get out. You really don't know. And I think throughout the whole movie, you want the girls just to survive. And with Mr. Reed, you spend a large portion just figuring out what his intentions even are. So it just makes the whole dynamic between the three of them very interesting, and just very fascinating to watch unfold. Next thing I want to talk about is the great production design. This house is where you spend about 90% of the movie, and you get to explore so much of it throughout the movie, despite spending large portions just in one area. I was very impressed by the level of detail and design of it. It just feels like a very impressive space to spend your time in. And I think something I should really mention here is if you haven't seen the movie yet, just be prepared to spend, a lot of this movie in a one location area. It's not as maybe grand as you'd expect for a movie like this. It's a very small movie, but you do get a lot of this house explored, and it feels very lived in. Like, it feels like a space that actually has a lot of thought behind it. There's a lot of doors behind doors, and just like areas that, have a lot behind them. This is also just a house that has a lot of rooms in it, and you don't really know where it begins and ends, and what sort of the levels are in this house, which I think is really, I think just adds to the tension of it. Like, each time you think the house kind of like ends, you see another place. This movie also has very good editing. Watching people talk for so long can be kind of exhausting to watch, but the editing sort of enhances these conversations. It makes them more interesting and intense to watch. I don't know if people are really going to notice this that much, but it's just like cutting back, seeing the reactions at the right time, seeing a different shot, cut to a different shot. I think just adds to making just these conversations feel a bit more like energetic and lively. It's just like, cutting back and forth for the same conversation for 20 minutes might get a little boring, but the movie just finds these really good ways of just putting you in a different, perspective, kind of moving things on a little bit, just figuring out when to really like change things up. I think the editing just adds a lot to what makes the movie kind of intense while watching these conversations. Like, it really, seeing the characters' reactions and their facial expressions kind of like makes you question what they're gonna do and say next, which I think adds a lot to it. Now, I also want to discuss the second half of this movie. Back earlier in the episode, I discussed that, the first half is just really conversations entirely. It's not really anything spooky going on. You'd actually kind of forget you're watching a horror movie. But the second half is when the movie does become more of a horror film, and it has some pretty spooky moments throughout it. I've seen some say this is where the movie falls apart a bit, and I think in the moment I could kind of see that. It's not as thought-provoking, but it does try something different. And upon further reflection and rewatching it, I think the second half still has a lot to offer, and kind of is more of a physical representation of what has been established prior. Like, you spend the first half of this movie just building things up, putting these ideas in the characters' heads, really just laying the groundwork. And the second half of this movie is just like a physical test of that. It's really just like putting the characters in the place and, seeing what they'll do, seeing what they'll say, and just putting them to the test all the time. And especially the ending, which I won't spoil, obviously. It might seem underwhelming at first glance, but actually I think it has a lot to think about and take away. Like, the whole movie, it just spends all this time building up to something, and when you get to the end, I think there might be a part of you that's like, really? That's it? Like, that was what this was all building towards? And again, I can kind of see that, but I think if you really do take the time to think about it, it actually says a lot about the movie and makes you think a lot about what you just saw and what it all means. I think especially on rewatch, it kind of just makes you see the whole thing a little more clearly. Like, it really just pushes what this actually is, what this movie's trying to say, and make you think about and talk about. I think it's very effective at that. And overall, I just think this is a very impactful movie. It's pretty spooky when it wants to be. It's also very thought-provoking. I just had a great time watching it both times. I think it's an awesome movie, and it gets better thinking about it, and will definitely be one of the more memorable movies of the year. Hugh Grant alone is just terrific here and worth seeing for this movie. I mean, just hearing one of the impressions he does, which I think is already online. Hopefully he doesn't get too far out there, because I think just seeing it in the movie is such a surprise. But I think just seeing all that makes it worthwhile. And it'll also be one of the more divisive movies among audiences due to the subject matter and the kind of movie this is. It's not for everyone. So I think know who you are, know what you're willing to take, because, if you just want a traditional horror movie, this is not going to probably satisfy you very much. If you just want a drama, that's not going to satisfy you very much. If you want to hear some thoughts on, like, the ideas of religion and kind of really, like, putting them to the test and seeing, where you stand on religion, I think this movie actually has a lot to say and will really make you think. If you're very firm in your thoughts on religion, just, you don't want to even think about any other possibilities, like you don't like the idea that there's no God out there, then don't watch this movie. It's not going to do anything for you. There's really just a lot to think about with this movie, and I just really love how much it just offers you a different perspective. Like, it's not preaching anything at you, it's not trying to make you think one thing. It kind of gives you a lot of reasons to think either or and take your own meaning away from it. I just love when movies do that, and this movie does it super well. And really, this is just a great, great film. Definitely one of my higher up films of the year, one that I enjoyed a great deal, and I would give it an A-. Definitely check it out if you're interested. But that about does it for this episode. If you want to follow my reviews, you can find me on Letterboxd at MovieKing1224. You could also listen to this podcast on your favorite apps such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. If you have any comments or feedback, I would love to hear it and improve the show. And of course, if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell to hear more like it. I appreciate you all so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.